The midday sun bathed the bustling city street in light, highlighting the chaotic symphony of life. Horns blared as taxis weaved through traffic, pedestrians hurried along sidewalks, and the faint hum of conversation mixed with the occasional laughter of children. Among the crowd was Mrs. Eleanor Harris, a frail elderly woman in her late 70s. Dressed in a neat floral dress, she clutched a cane in one hand and a small handbag in the other. She stood at the curb, her face tense as she waited for the crossing signal. The light changed, and she stepped forward cautiously, the shuffle of her feet slow but determined. Nearby, 12-year-old Malik walked along the sidewalk, a bag of groceries swinging lightly in his hand. His hoodie was a bit too big, his sneakers worn but sturdy. He hummed softly to himself, thinking about the dinner he'd promised to help his mom prepare. Life wasn't easy in his neighborhood, but Malik's mom had taught him the importance of gratitude and helping others. It was a lesson that had shaped him deeply. The calm of the day shattered in an instant. The sudden screech of tires tore through the air, followed by the gut-wrenching sound of metal colliding with a lamppost. People froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the noise. A silver sedan, its front crumpled from the crash, sat smoking ominously near the intersection. Debris scattered across the street, and panic rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Harris, startled by the commotion, stumbled mid-crossing. Her cane slipped from her grasp, clattering to the asphalt. She fell to her knees in the middle of the street, her face stricken with fear, as cars screeched and swerved to avoid her. Drivers honked, shouting at her to move, but no one left their vehicles to help. She looked around helplessly, tears welling in her eyes. "Please," she cried weakly, "someone help me." Malik stopped in his tracks, his eyes locking on the scene ahead. He saw the smoking car, the dazed driver slumped over the wheel, and Mrs. Harris trembling in the middle of the chaos. His heart pounded as he took it all in. For a moment, fear held him still. The shouts of onlookers rang out around him, but then Malik remembered what his mom always said. If you see someone who needs help and you can help them, you do it. No hesitation. He dropped his grocery bag and sprinted toward Mrs. Harris, weaving between honking cars and ignoring the yells of people warning him to stay back. "Kid, get out of there! It's dangerous!" someone shouted. But Malik didn't slow down. His sneakers slapped against the pavement as he reached her. "Mom, I'm here," he said, his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. "I'm going to get you out of here." Mrs. Harris looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude and fear. Malik gently helped her to her feet, her frail frame leaning heavily on him. He grabbed her cane with one hand and wrapped his arm around her waist to steady her. "Come on," he urged, guiding her toward the sidewalk. The acrid smell of smoke thickened in the air, and the wrecked car hissed ominously. Onlookers gasped as flames began to lick at the edges of the vehicle. "Kid, get back! It could blow!" someone screamed. Malik gritted his teeth, refusing to stop. Step by step, he led Mrs. Harris away from the wreckage, his small frame supporting her weight. They were just a few feet from the curb when a deafening boom erupted behind them. The car burst into flames, sending a wave of heat and smoke through the street. Malik shielded Mrs. Harris with his body as the explosion knocked them both to the ground. People screamed and some rushed forward to help. Malik scrambled to his feet, pulling Mrs. Harris up again and finally leading her to safety on the sidewalk. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaky but concerned. Mrs. Harris, tears streaming down her soot-streaked face, nodded. "You saved my life," she whispered. Malik managed a small smile. I just did what anyone should do. The crackling flames and acrid smoke of the burning car lingered in the air, but Malik and Mrs. Harris were finally safe on the sidewalk. Paramedics were just arriving, their sirens wailing, but for the moment, time seemed to stand still. Mrs. Harris, still trembling, clung to Malik's arm as tears streaked her soot-covered face. Her words came out in a trembling whisper. "You saved my life, young man. You risked everything for me." Malik shifted awkwardly, uncomfortable with the attention but unable to pull away from her grateful grip. "I couldn't just leave you there," he said softly, his gaze falling to the ground. I wanted to help." She studied him for a moment, her tear-filled eyes searching his face. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm just someone who wanted to help," Malik replied humbly, shrugging. He glanced toward the wrecked car, now engulfed in flames, and then back at Mrs. Harris. "That's all." The paramedics approached, placing a blanket around Mrs. Harris's shoulders and carefully guiding her to sit on the back of the ambulance. She refused to let go of Malik's hand. "Come with me," she insisted, her voice still trembling. "Let me make sure you're okay. Please." Malik shook his head gently. "I can't, ma'am. My mom and little sister are waiting for me at home. I have to get back." Mrs. Harris looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and awe, squeezing his hand one last time before letting go. "You're a remarkable boy," she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. As the paramedics began to tend to her, a crowd of onlookers who had gathered around began to speak up. "That kid's a hero," one man said, shaking his head in amazement. "He ran straight into the fire without thinking twice." Another woman stepped closer, her phone still in her hand from recording the scene. "Why'd you risk it, kid?" she asked, her voice curious but kind. "That was so dangerous. You could have been killed." Malik paused, looking at the woman for a moment before answering simply. "I just couldn't leave her there," he said, his voice steady. "She needed help, and no one else was moving." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding, others clapping lightly. A man patted Malik on the shoulder and said, "The world could use more kids like you." Malik gave a small, awkward smile before glancing down at the groceries he'd abandoned earlier. Most of them were spilled and ruined, but he bent down to pick up what he could. "I really gotta get home now," he mumbled, trying to avoid the growing attention. As he turned to leave, someone called out, "Hey kid, what's your name?" Malik paused for a moment before replying, "It's Malik." Then, without another word, he walked off, leaving the crowd buzzing about his bravery. Behind him, Mrs. Harris watched him go, her heart full of gratitude for the boy who had saved her life. The familiar creak of the apartment door greeted Malik as he stepped into his home, carrying the remnants of the groceries he had managed to salvage. The dim hallway was lit only by the faint glow of a flickering candle on the kitchen counter. Their tiny apartment was clean but worn, with peeling wallpaper and mismatched furniture that had seen better days. Malik's younger sister, Maya, sat on the couch, hugging a frayed teddy bear, her face lighting up the moment she saw him. "Malik!" she exclaimed, running over to hug him tightly. "What took you so long? I was getting scared." "Sorry, Maya," he said, ruffling her hair. "I had to help someone." He set the groceries on the counter, carefully separating the few unspoiled items. Their mother, Maria, entered the room, her uniform stained from another long shift at the diner. Her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but she smiled faintly at the sight of her children. "You're late," she said gently, wiping her hands on a towel. "What happened?" Malik hesitated. "There was an accident. A lady needed help, so I got her out of the street." He kept his explanation brief, not wanting to worry her. Maria's smile faded, and she sat down heavily at the small table. "Malik," she began, her tone both loving and firm, "I'm proud of your kindness, but you can't take risks like that. You're just a boy. If something happened to you—" Her voice cracked, and she took a deep breath. "We can't afford to lose you, do you understand?" "I understand, Mama," Malik said softly, though his gaze remained steady. "But she needed help. I couldn't just leave her there." Maria sighed and reached for his hand, squeezing it. "You have a big heart, Malik. Just don't let it get you hurt." The flicker of the candle reminded them of another challenge. Once again, the electricity had been cut off. Malik moved to the table, pulling out his school books and laying them under the candlelight. He flipped through the pages, glancing at Maya as she sat beside him, staring down at her feet. "What's wrong, Maya?" he asked gently. She shrugged, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't want to go to school tomorrow." "Why not?" She hesitated before pointing at her shoes, the soles worn thin and held together with tape. "Everyone laughs at me." Malik felt a pang in his chest, but forced a smile. "It's okay, Maya. Don't let them bother you. One day, things will be different." "I promise," Maya sniffled, looking up at him. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Malik said, his voice firm. "One day, we'll have a house with no leaks, no power cuts, and no worries. You'll see." Maria watched quietly, her heart breaking and swelling with pride at the same time. Malik's dreams were big, but his determination was bigger. She just hoped the world would give him a chance. The morning sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of Mr. Harris's penthouse office, casting a golden glow on the sleek, modern decor. Seated at his massive oak desk, Mr. Harris, a polished real estate tycoon in his late 40s, sipped his coffee as he skimmed through documents. His assistant interrupted with a knock at the door. "Your mother is here," the assistant said, her tone cautious. Mrs. Harris swept into the room, her cane tapping against the marble floor. Though still recovering from the ordeal, her fiery determination was unshaken. "We need to talk," she declared, fixing her son with a stern look. Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair, setting his coffee down. "Mother, you shouldn't be out of bed. What's this about?" Mrs. Harris took a seat and recounted the events of the previous day, the screech of tires, the crash, and the boy who risked everything to save her. Her voice trembled as she described how Malik had run into danger without hesitation. "He saved my life, David," she said, her eyes glistening with emotion. "If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here." Mr. Harris listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded. "That's incredible. I'll have my assistant send the boy a check, a generous one." Mrs. Harris's jaw tightened, her cane thudding against the floor. "A check? Is that all you can offer?" "What would you have me do?" Mr. Harris asked, his tone sharp. "He's a kid, Mother. I can't change his life overnight." Mrs. Harris's voice rose, her frustration boiling over. "That boy didn't hesitate to risk his life for me, someone he didn't even know, and you want to toss him money like it's a business deal. You need to see where he comes from. You need to understand what he's up against." Her words hit Mr. Harris harder than he expected. He rubbed his temples, sighing. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll look into it." True to his word, Mr. Harris used his vast network of connections to track Malik down. Within hours, he had an address, an apartment complex on the east side of town. His driver hesitated as they approached the rundown building, its peeling paint and broken windows a stark contrast to the gleaming towers Mr. Harris was used to. The car came to a stop, and Mr. Harris stepped out, adjusting his tailored suit. He scanned the area, taking in the cracked sidewalks and makeshift basketball hoop tied to a streetlight. Children played barefoot in the distance, their laughter ringing out despite their surroundings. It was a world far removed from his own, a world he hadn't thought about in years. As he walked toward the building, he spotted a boy through an open window, bent over a table lit by a flickering candle. It was Malik. Even from a distance, Mr. Harris could see the determination in his face, the same resolve his mother had described. Something inside Mr. Harris shifted. This wasn't just about a reward anymore. The sleek black car rolled to a stop in front of the crumbling apartment complex. Mr. Harris stepped out, his polished shoes crunching against the broken glass scattered across the sidewalk. He adjusted his tie, his sharp suit an almost alien contrast to the peeling paint and rusted metal railings of the building. Children played barefoot in the courtyard, their laughter echoing through the air despite the dilapidated surroundings. Mr. Harris couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort. It had been years since he'd seen conditions like this up close. He hadn't realized how far removed his life had become. He walked cautiously up the cracked steps of the building, his eyes scanning the graffiti-stained walls and broken light fixtures. A neighbor, balancing a laundry basket on her hip, gave him a wary glance before disappearing into her unit. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete and cooking oil. For a man who spent his days in luxury high-rises, it was a jarring reminder of a world he had long ignored. Reaching the door listed in the address he'd been given, Mr. Harris paused when he heard a voice through the thin walls. It was Malik's. "One day, I'll get us out of here," the boy was saying. "I'll make sure we have a real house with no leaks and lights that don't flicker. You'll see, Maya." His sister's soft voice responded, full of hope. "You mean it?" "Of course I mean it," Malik said firmly. "You just wait." Mr. Harris swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He took a deep breath and knocked. The door opened a crack, revealing Malik's mother, Maria. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw the tall, well-dressed stranger standing before her. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Good afternoon," Mr. Harris said, his tone polite but earnest. "My name is David Harris. Your son Malik saved my mother's life yesterday. I'm here to thank him." Maria blinked, processing his words, before opening the door fully. "Malik," she called over her shoulder, "come here." Malik appeared a moment later, his eyes widening as he recognized Mr. Harris. He shifted nervously, unsure what to say. "Sir," he began, Mr. Harris raised a hand to stop him. "Let me speak first," he said. "Malik, my mother told me what you did for her. Running into danger like that, risking your life to save hers, most people wouldn't have done that. I came here today to thank you in person." Malik shrugged, shuffling his feet. "I just did what anyone should do," he said simply. Mr. Harris studied the boy for a moment, then glanced around the small apartment. The living room was neat but sparse, the furniture old and patched. A candle burned on the table, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed from the kitchen. Despite the modest surroundings, there was an undeniable sense of dignity in the way everything was cared for. Maria's face flushed slightly as she noticed Mr. Harris looking around. "I'm sorry about the state of the place," she said quickly. "It's not much, but we do our best." Mr. Harris turned to her, his expression softening. "You don't need to apologize for anything," he said, his voice steady. "You've raised a remarkable son. That speaks volumes." Maria's eyes welled with tears, and she quickly looked away. Malik stood quietly, unsure how to respond. The weight of the moment hung in the air, heavy, yet meaningful. After a pause, Mr. Harris spoke again. "Your family deserves more than this," he said. Malik's bravery has shown me how much potential lies in places I've ignored for far too long. If you'll allow me, I'd like to do something to help." Maria hesitated, her pride and gratitude warring within her. Malik, meanwhile, stared at Mr. Harris, his young face filled with quiet determination. "Thank you, sir," he said softly, "but we don't need charity. We just need a chance." Mr. Harris smiled faintly, realizing that the boy's strength came from more than just courage. It came from character. "I'll make sure you have it." The morning sun cast a soft glow over the apartment complex as a sleek black car pulled up once again. This time, it wasn't just Mr. Harris stepping out. Mrs. Harris joined him, leaning on her cane with a warm but determined smile. Behind them, a few members of Mr. Harris's legal team carried briefcases, their serious expressions contrasting with the humble surroundings. Inside the apartment, Malik and his mother were just finishing breakfast when the knock came. Maria opened the door to find Mr. Harris and his entourage. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Harris," she greeted, her voice hesitant but polite. "I wasn't expecting you again." "Good morning," he said with a smile. "May we come in?" "There's something important I'd like to discuss with you and Malik." Maria hesitated briefly before stepping aside to let them in. Malik appeared from the kitchen, his eyebrows raising in confusion at the sight of the group. "What's going on?" he asked. Once everyone was seated in the small living room, Mr. Harris cleared his throat. "First, I want to thank you both for welcoming us into your home," he began, glancing at Maria and then at Malik. "Yesterday, I saw firsthand the strength and dignity in this family, and I've been thinking a lot about how to properly thank you for saving my mother's life." Maria started to speak, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Please, let me finish. Malik, your courage reminded me of something I had forgotten, that the greatest wealth isn't measured in money, but in kindness, bravery, and the lives we touch." He gestured toward his legal team, who opened a briefcase and laid out a stack of documents on the table. "I wanted to do something meaningful, something that honors your family's strength and Malik's bravery. These," he said, pointing to the papers, "are the deeds to a new home for you and your family. It's in a safe neighborhood with good schools and opportunities. No leaks, no flickering lights, a real home." Maria gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes as she struggled to process his words. Before she could respond, Mr. Harris continued. "That's not all. I've also set up a trust fund for Malik. This will cover his education and ensure he has the resources to follow his dreams, whatever they may be." Maria shook her head, overwhelmed. This is too much," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't accept this." Mrs. Harris, seated beside her son, leaned forward, her eyes kind and understanding. "This isn't charity, my dear," she said softly. "This is gratitude. My life is priceless, and your son saved it without hesitation. What your family has shown us is something we'll never forget." Mr. Harris nodded. "This isn't a handout," he added. "This is my way of saying thank you to the boy who reminded me what courage and kindness truly look like." Maria wiped her tears, her voice cracking as she whispered, "I don't know how to thank you." Malik, sitting quietly until now, finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to thank him, Mama," he said, looking at Mr. Harris with a steady gaze. "I'll make sure this isn't wasted. I'll work hard. I'll make you proud." Mr. Harris smiled, moved by the boy's determination. "You already have, Malik. You already have." As the papers were signed and the process finalized, the weight of their struggles seemed to lift, replaced by hope and possibility. Maria embraced her children tightly, her tears falling freely now. Malik, holding back his own, glanced at Mr. Harris and said quietly, "Thank you for everything." Mr. Harris placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a small but meaningful gesture. "The world needs more people like you, Malik. I just gave you a house. You gave me something much greater, a reason to believe in the goodness of people again." The room fell into a reverent silence, filled only with the sound of a family beginning to dream again. The day the family moved into their new home was one Malik would never forget. The bright, spacious house was worlds away from the cramped apartment they had left behind. For the first time in years, the air felt light, and hope filled every corner. Malik stood in his new bedroom, staring out the window at the safe, quiet neighborhood. He smiled as Maya ran through the halls, her laughter echoing in the space that finally felt like a real home. In his new school, Malik thrived. With fewer distractions and more resources, he poured himself into his studies, earning top marks and joining the school's mentorship program. Mrs. Harris became a regular visitor, offering wisdom and encouragement over tea in their cozy living room. She often reminded Malik, "Kindness and courage will take you far. Never forget the boy who ran into the fire." Meanwhile, Mr. Harris underwent a transformation of his own. Malik's bravery had stirred something in him, and he could no longer ignore the struggles of others. Using his resources and connections, he launched a revitalization initiative in Malik's old neighborhood. Community centers were built, schools were renovated, and affordable housing projects sprang up where crumbling buildings once stood. Jobs were created, and hope began to take root in a place that had long been forgotten. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new community center, Mr. Harris stood before a crowd of residents. "I spent my life building wealth," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But that boy, Malik, taught me what it means to truly give. His selflessness reminded me of the power we have to change lives, not just with money, but with purpose." Malik, standing in the crowd with his family, listened quietly. As the applause erupted, he felt pride not for himself, but for the transformation that had been set into motion. His one act of bravery had sparked something far greater, proving that kindness could ripple outward and change the world. The sun shone brightly over the newly renovated community center, its fresh paint and modern design a beacon of hope in Malik's old neighborhood. A crowd of families, children, and community leaders gathered for the grand opening, their faces lit with anticipation. Malik, now a confident young man in his 20s, stood at the podium, his tailored suit and calm demeanor a reflection of how far he had come. He cleared his throat, the murmurs of the crowd quieting as all eyes turned to him. It all started with one moment. Malik began, his voice steady but full of emotion. One choice to help someone in need. That choice didn't just change their life, it changed mine, too. He paused, glancing at the smiling faces before him. That moment taught me the power of kindness, the impact of courage. And now, standing here, I realize that it wasn't just about that day. It was about what came after. How that one act inspired more acts, more change. This community center isn't just a building. It's proof that even in the hardest circumstances, we can build something better, together. The crowd erupted into applause, and Malik stepped back, his heart swelling with pride. After the ceremony, he walked through the bustling halls of the center, watching kids laugh and play in spaces filled with light and color. He stopped at one of the classrooms where a group of young kids gathered around him, their faces bright with curiosity. One boy, no older than 10, tugged on Malik's sleeve. "Do you think I can make a difference too?" he asked, his eyes wide with hope. Malik crouched down to meet the boy's gaze and smiled warmly. "Of course you can," he said. "It only takes one act of kindness to change everything." As the boy's face lit up, Malik stood, watching the children run off to play. He knew that his journey had come full circle, and the legacy of that one moment would live on through the lives he inspired.